Hey folks, today I'm going to share some free open source resources on how to make authentic old school retro video game instruments. Yeah, I struggled a little on the title. Let's get started. The three consoles we'll look at are the ones that we all probably grew up with, the NES, Genesis, and SNES. All these years later, I'm still hooked on those iconic chiptunes and that chonky pixel art. Going chronologically, let's start with the Nintendo Entertainment System. When you think of the music from the NES, it's pretty incredible what they were able to create with such a limited sound palette. The system could produce 5 types of sounds: 2 pulse waves used for lead and melody, a triangle wave used typically for bass, a noise channel used for things like explosions or drums, and a delta modulation channel which played audio samples that were stored on the cartridge. By combining and manipulating these instruments, game developers could create a wide range of sounds and music for the NES, from the symphonic opening to Legend of Zelda, to the Iron Maiden-esque jams of Mega Man 2. One of the most popular ways to create the sounds of the NES is to use a text-based tracker. For a more visual approach, I really love using Beatbox. It's an open source browser-based editor that will have you making chiptunes in no time. There is a bit of a learning curve, but it's honestly pretty intuitive. If you want to take things further, there is more here than just the NES sounds, but if you want to stick to the NES constraints, you will find the pulse waves, triangles, and noise channels all here. It's really cool. If you prefer to work with audio files directly, Adventure Kid Waveforms has a public domain NES sound pack that includes a single cycle waveform for each of the instruments. Just take one of the files, add it to a sampler instrument, loop it, and now you can play the instruments in your favorite DAW. The one downside to this approach is that it's only one sound for each instrument, but I have an alternative for that. The third and final option for NES is to use a new open source project I just released on GitHub called NES Waveforms. Last week I stumbled upon a new YouTube channel called NES Hacker that does development tutorials. Fast forward a couple hours and before you knew it, I had this. NES Waveforms is a simple homebrew ROM that plays a bunch of waveforms in chromatic scales that you can use to create virtual instruments. Capture these sounds from the cart, and just like the Adventure Kid waveforms, you can use them to build sampler instruments. I always dreamed of making an NES game, so now I can mark that one off the bucket list. Next, let's move on to the SEGA Genesis. You know, I'm just going to stick with calling it the Genesis, even though Mega Drive is a way cooler name. We just didn't call it that in the US. Like the NES, the Genesis was capable of generating pulse waves and playing back different short sound samples, but the true blast processing sonic power of the Genesis was from the YM2612, a 4-operator FM synthesis chip which has a very distinct sound for a lot of crunchy metallic tones. The Yamaha DX7 is a popular 80s synth that uses 6-operator FM synthesis, so the best way to get the sounds of the Genesis is to emulate the DX7 using the free open source FM synth plugin, Dext. There are various Dext preset packages that you can find online that I'll link in the description. The first one is linked on the actual Dext download page, and it has all the original patches for the DX7 plus much more. I somehow missed these when I first downloaded Dext, but they're kind of the gold standard in terms of official Yamaha patches. The next one is Dr. Washington's SEGA Genesis presets. Doctor. This has a ton of Genesis instruments from just about any game you could ever want. The only downside to it is that the files are hosted on MediaFire. I'm just not a fan of grabbing random files off the internet, but if you want the full list, I'll link to Dr. Washington's forum post. If you want a more curated, concise preset list, I've compiled and uploaded a YM2612 Dex preset project on GitHub. It contains 4 cartridges with 32 presets each of the best bass, keys, synth, and more for the SEGA Genesis. Honorable mention here, my homies over at AudioKit launched SEGA Synth earlier this year, so if you're looking for the sounds of the Genesis on your iOS device with AUV3 support, be sure to check it out. The final option for the Genesis is to use sound fonts. This is where we start sliding into the licensing gray area. Remember how the NES has the delta modulation channel for playing actual audio files? Well, the Genesis has that too, albeit with much higher fidelity and storage capacity. That means for things like the snare drum and Sonic the Hedgehog, they're getting to use actual audio files. Nintendo would soon catch up with the release of the Super Nintendo that uses the Sony SPC 700 chip. This chip played PCM audio samples for more realistic sounding instrumentation. So in other words, it's a rompler. Kind of. So because these instruments are built with actual audio files, you can't legally use them in commercial works without the copyright holder's permission. But if that doesn't deter you and you just want the sounds for your own personal use, the best place I've found is to use sound fonts or sample libraries. The best site I've found for game-related sound fonts is musical-artifacts.com. They host a wide variety of sound fonts, but again, the use of the sounds might not be permitted by the original copyright holders, even if the person that uploaded them says it's okay. I'll link in the description a video by Ted Syndicate where he discusses more about SNES sound fonts and the ones he uses for his music. One option that is neither free nor open source that he mentions using is Super Audio Cart by Impact Soundworks for Contact. This pack has a multitude of consoles with licensed sound samples, and here's a quick screenshot of their legal FAQ. Basically, they're using sound samples that have been processed to sound like the SNES audio since, quote, it would not be legal to record and sample the sounds of existing SNES or Amiga games. And that's it. Hopefully these tools help you get started in making some authentic retro video game music. Let me know down in the comments if there are any open source options that I missed. There are several other programs that people use to create chiptune stuff, but even if some of them are free, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily open source, and many of them don't really adhere to the constraints of the systems. If you enjoyed this video, you might also like this one where I take a look at SEGA Synth for iOS by AudioKit Pro. But that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.